Imagine two equally wealthy families, both with more money than most people will ever see in their entire lives. One family lives in New York, surrounded by investors, entrepreneurs, and an environment where new fortunes are born every single year. The other lives in England, part of a social circle built across generations, where last names, traditions, and legacy still carry enormous weight. At first glance, they seem to have everything in common, but there is one fascinating difference between them, and in this video, you are going to discover exactly what it is. Because when we talk about American old money and British old money, we are not just comparing wealth, we are comparing two completely different ways of seeing status, influence, family, and legacy. And when we put these two worlds side by side, the question stops being who has more money. The real question is, who actually lives better? And, more importantly, which life would you choose? Before we continue, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious. And subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Continuing with today's topic, two families, two visions of the world. The most interesting part of this comparison is that both families probably consider themselves successful. After all, they live comfortably, have access to the best schools, the best neighborhoods, the most exclusive social circles and opportunities that most people will never have. And yet, they see success in completely different ways. For many American old money families, wealth is something that must keep growing. Each new generation receives the responsibility of expanding what was built before them, whether through new businesses, new investments, or new opportunities capable of increasing the family's assets even further. For many British old money families, the logic tends to be different. The concern isn't always about growing the fortune, but about protecting what already exists, preserving family traditions, maintaining a reputation built over generations, and ensuring that the family legacy continues long after its current members are gone. At first glance, this might seem like just a small difference in mindset, but it ends up influencing practically every aspect of these families' lives, from the way children are raised to the expectations placed on them, passing through the way they see marriage, friendships, money, and even the very meaning of success. Because at its core, American old money and British old money were born in completely different realities. And perhaps that is exactly why they continue thinking in such distinct ways today. But this difference raises an even more interesting question. If these families see wealth in such different ways, where did it all begin? To answer that, we need to go back to the beginning and understand how these fortunes were built. Because the origin of money can reveal far more about a family than the balance in their bank account. To understand why these families see wealth so differently today, we need to go back a few centuries and look at the origins of their fortunes. Because although both groups are called old money, the truth is that American old money and British old money were born in completely different environments. In the United States, many of the great fortunes emerged during periods of extraordinary economic growth. It was the era of railroads, oil, banks, industry, and great entrepreneurs who helped transform a young country into an economic powerhouse. Families like the Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, Carnegies, and Mellons didn't inherit century-old empires. They built them. This created a mindset that can still be felt in many American old money families today. Wealth wasn't just something that existed, it was something that needed to be created. And if it was possible to build a fortune once, then perhaps it was possible to build another. That's why, even among extremely wealthy families, there is often an admiration for ambition, entrepreneurship, and the ability to generate new opportunities. In the United Kingdom, the story followed a different path. Long before the Industrial Revolution transformed the world economy, there were already influential families controlling vast stretches of land, occupying important positions in society, and passing their status from generation to generation. In many cases, the family surname already carried value long before any modern business existed. Wealth was tied to land, legacy, social position, and continuity. While many American families grew by building companies, many British families grew by managing assets that had already existed for centuries. And that difference continues to influence the way they see money today. On one side, we find a culture that frequently values the building of wealth. On the other, a culture that frequently values the preservation of what has already been achieved. But this leads us to an even more interesting question. If these fortunes were born in such different ways, how does each of them prepare their children to take on that responsibility? Because the way a family educates the next generation usually reveals a great deal about what it truly values. If there is one thing that all old money families take extremely seriously, it is the preparation of the next generation. After all, building a fortune is already difficult, but keeping it alive for decades, or even centuries, is an even greater challenge. And it is precisely here that we begin to see some of the most interesting differences between American and British old money. In the United States, many families see education as a tool for creating independence. From an early age, children are often encouraged to develop skills, build careers, and prove their own worth, even knowing they were born into privileged circumstances. It is not uncommon to find heirs of great fortunes attending universities like Harvard, Yale, or Princeton, and then following their own paths in business, finance, technology, or areas that spark their personal interest. There is an implicit expectation that each generation contributes in some way to the family's growth. Inheriting alone is not enough. You must add value. In the United Kingdom, education is also extremely valued, but there is often an additional layer tied to tradition and continuity. Institutions like Eton, Harrow, Oxford, and Cambridge are not just places of learning. They are environments where social networks, friendships, and connections are built and strengthened over decades. In many cases, sons, fathers, grandfathers, and even great-grandfathers attended the same schools. And this creates a sense of continuity that goes far beyond formal education. While some American families might ask their children what they want to build in the future, many British families tend to ask how they intend to honor what was built before them. Neither of these approaches is necessarily better. They are simply reflections of different histories. One was born in an environment that valued growth, innovation, and expansion. The other emerged in a society that valued stability, tradition, and permanence. And perhaps that is why the expectations placed on children are also so different. Because when a child grows up hearing that they need to build something great, they tend to see the future in one way. When they grow up hearing that they need to protect a century-old legacy, they tend to see it in another. But education is only the beginning, because as these children become adults, a question arises that may be even more important for these families. Who will they marry? And it is precisely there that wealth, status, tradition, and influence begin to mix in extremely interesting ways. When we think about extremely wealthy families, it's natural to imagine they have complete freedom to choose any path they want. But the reality tends to be a little more complex, because for many old money families, marriage never involves just two people. In a way, it also involves two families, two histories, and, very often, two legacies. This doesn't mean marriages are arranged or that love doesn't matter, but it does mean that factors like education, values, reputation, and social circle frequently receive far more attention than most people would imagine. In the United States, old money families tend to move in very specific environments. Prestigious universities, private clubs, charity events, foundations, and exclusive organizations end up creating opportunities for their children to meet people who share similar life experiences. The result is that many relationships arise naturally within these circles. In the United Kingdom, this phenomenon can be even more evident. For centuries, the most traditional families developed extremely close social networks, where well-known surnames frequently crossed paths generation after generation. In some cases, families have known each other for so long that their histories end up intertwined in ways that are difficult to find anywhere else, and this creates an interesting dynamic. While most of the population sees marriage as an exclusively personal choice, many old money families also view this decision through the lens of family continuity. The question isn't always just, who do you love? Sometimes the question is also, who will share the responsibility of preserving what was built before you? This helps explain why some of these families seem to place such high value on discretion, compatibility, and long-term stability. Because when a fortune crosses several generations, the consequences of certain decisions can also last for decades. But there is something even more curious. Despite all this concern with legacy, tradition, and continuity, American and British families tend to express their wealth in very different ways. And it is precisely there that the comparison becomes even more fascinating, because the way someone spends money can reveal a great deal about what they truly value. If there is one area where the differences between American old money and British old money become visible quickly, it is in the way these families choose to live. Because although both possess extraordinary resources, they don't always feel the need to demonstrate that wealth in the same way. In the United States, even among old money families, there is a culture that tends to value comfort, convenience, and, in some cases, a certain celebration of financial success. It is not unusual to find families living in luxury penthouses in Manhattan, properties in Palm Beach, vacation homes in Aspen, or impressive residences in the most valued neighborhoods in the country. There is a distinctly American idea that success can be appreciated and enjoyed. After all, if a family spent generations building wealth, why not enjoy part of it? In the United Kingdom, the relationship with wealth tends to feel a little different. This doesn't mean British families are less rich or less privileged. In fact, many live in properties worth fortunes, but there is frequently a stronger preference for discretion. A centuries-old country house may hide far more wealth than a modern apartment with a view of Central Park. A carefully preserved older car may say more about status than a brand new supercar. And this difference tends to surprise many people. Because the richest person in the room isn't always the one who looks the richest. In many British old money circles, displaying wealth excessively can even be seen as unnecessary. The assets exist, the status exists, but there isn't the same need to prove it all the time. In the United States, the relationship between wealth and success tends to be more visible. Not necessarily through ostentation, but because American culture has always had a very strong connection with personal achievement and financial conquest, and this ends up influencing the way many families choose to live, travel, and enjoy their wealth. Interestingly, neither of these approaches is necessarily better. They simply reflect different values. One tends to value the building and enjoyment of wealth more. The other tends to value the continuity and preservation of a traditional way of life more. But this leads us to an even more interesting question, because spending money is one thing. Keeping a fortune alive across generations is a completely different challenge, and it is precisely there that we discover why some families manage to preserve their wealth for over 100 years, while others see great fortunes disappear in just a few decades. Building wealth is difficult, but curiously, keeping a great fortune alive across several generations tends to be even harder. There is even a fairly well-known saying in the financial world that the first generation builds, the second expands, and the third often loses everything. And while this doesn't always happen, the truth is that many fortunes have disappeared in exactly that way. That is why one of the greatest concerns of old money families, both in the United States and the United Kingdom, is ensuring that what was built continues to exist long after the current generation is gone. In the United States, this typically involves a combination of financial planning, asset protection structures, family funds, diversified investments, and a strong focus on financial education. From an early age, many heirs learn that wealth is not just something to be consumed, it is something that needs to be managed. The idea is simple. If each generation spends more than it preserves, eventually the assets disappear. In the United Kingdom, the concern is similar, but it is frequently tied to something even greater than money. Many families are not just protecting financial assets. They are protecting historic properties, art collections, family traditions, and even responsibilities that have crossed centuries. In some cases, a property has belonged to the same family for so long that it ends up becoming part of the family's very identity. And this completely changes the way wealth is viewed, because wealth stops being just a financial resource. It comes to represent a responsibility, a connection between past, present, and future. That is precisely why many of these families make decisions thinking in decades, not months. While most people plan the next few years, some of these families are thinking about the next generation, or even the generation after that. And perhaps it is this long-term vision that explains why certain fortunes manage to survive for so long. But there is an even more interesting question, because protecting wealth and protecting status are not exactly the same thing. A family can have billions of dollars and still not possess the same social prestige as another, far less wealthy one. Which brings us to one of the most fascinating differences between American and British old money. After all, what really counts for more at the top of society? Money or status? For most people, this question seems to have a fairly simple answer. After all, if you have enough money, shouldn't you be able to get practically everything you want? Better homes, better schools, more comfort, more opportunities, and a much more comfortable life. But when we observe the world of old money, we quickly realize that the relationship between money and status is far more complex than it appears. In the United States, wealth and prestige tend to go hand in hand. When someone builds a billion-dollar company, creates something innovative, or accumulates an extraordinary fortune, society tends to recognize that success almost immediately, because there is a very strong cultural admiration for those who manage to build something great. In the United Kingdom, however, the logic can be different. Status doesn't always depend solely on the size of the fortune. In some circles, family history, tradition, social connections, and a reputation built over generations can carry as much weight as the assets themselves. And that is precisely what creates some curious situations. An American family may possess far more money than a traditional British family, and still not enjoy the same type of prestige within certain social environments. At first glance, this seems contradictory, but it makes sense when we understand that we are looking at two systems built on different values. One admiring primarily what was conquered, and the other valuing what was preserved over time. Perhaps that is exactly why some of the most influential families in England rarely appear on the world's richest people lists, while some of the greatest American fortunes emerged in just a few generations. Neither of these models is necessarily better. They simply define success in different ways. But this leads us to an even more interesting question. If wealth and status don't mean exactly the same thing, which of these worlds is more difficult to access? Because building a great fortune already seems complicated enough, but entering certain social circles can be a completely different challenge. And it is precisely there that the comparison between American and British old money becomes even more fascinating. Up until now, it might seem like we are just talking about two different versions of wealth. But there is a question that almost always comes up when we observe these two universes side by side. Which one is really harder to access? In the United States, as distant as the elite might seem to most people, there is a deeply rooted belief that the path remains open. Difficult, without a doubt, but open. The idea that someone can build a company, create an innovation, accumulate wealth, and eventually reach the most exclusive circles of society is part of the American narrative itself. That is why new fortunes keep emerging generation after generation. New entrepreneurs appear, new sectors of the economy are created, and new families find ways to reach positions that, a few decades earlier, seemed unreachable. Over time, some of these families end up sharing spaces, schools, clubs, and relationships with families who had already been accumulating wealth long before they were born. In the United Kingdom, the dynamic tends to be a little different. Money certainly opens doors, but not all of them. There are social circles built over centuries, family traditions passed down between generations, and connections that simply cannot be acquired in the same way you buy a house or a company. And perhaps that is the most interesting difference between the two systems. While the United States tends to admire those who manage to reach the top, British culture tends to admire those who manage to stay there for a very long time. One celebrates the rise, the other values continuity. The more we observe these differences, the more we realize that wealth and freedom don't always mean the same thing. Because inheriting a great fortune might seem like the perfect scenario. But what happens when that fortune also brings expectations, responsibilities, and the constant pressure of protecting something that has existed for generations? And it is precisely there that the comparison begins to reveal a side that few people consider when they think about wealth. Because the next question may be the most important of all. Which of these lifestyles offers more freedom to those born within it? When people imagine old money families, they generally think of absolute freedom. After all, if you were born surrounded by wealth, opportunities, and financial security, what could possibly limit your choices? But reality tends to be more complicated than it appears, because every great fortune comes with expectations, and the older the fortune, the greater those expectations tend to be. In the United States, many heirs grow up hearing that they should honor the work of previous generations, but there is frequently room for them to find their own path. Some follow the family business, others build completely different careers, and there are even those who decide to create something entirely new on their own. The idea of independence continues to occupy an important place within American culture, even among extremely wealthy families. In the United Kingdom, the situation can be a little different. When a family carries centuries of history, the sense of responsibility tends to be greater. It's not just about managing money. Many times, it's about preserving historic properties, maintaining family traditions, representing a well-known surname, and protecting a legacy that existed long before the current generation was born. And this creates a curious situation. From the outside, everything looks like privilege. But from the inside, some people may feel that they received not just an inheritance, but a mission they never asked for, a mission that may last a lifetime. That is why some American heirs describe wealth as a platform for building their own future, while some British heirs describe it as a responsibility that must be carried with care. Neither of these experiences is necessarily better or worse. They are simply different ways of living within the same world of wealth, and perhaps it is precisely there that we find one of the greatest differences between these two worlds. Because in the end, the question is not just who has more money, more status, or more influence. The real question is which of these lives offers more freedom to define your own destiny. And when we look at everything we have seen so far, the origins of the fortunes, The education of the children, the marriages, the lifestyle, the protection of assets, and the expectations placed on each generation. We finally arrive at the question that gave rise to this video. After all, between American old money and British old money, who really lives better? After everything we have seen so far, perhaps you have noticed that this comparison is far less about money than it appears at first glance. Because in purely financial terms, there are extraordinarily wealthy families on both sides of the Atlantic. Both have access to the best opportunities, the best schools, the best professionals, and a level of financial security that most people will never experience. But wealth was never the only variable in this equation. What makes this comparison so interesting is that each group seems to pursue a different goal. For many American old money families, success is tied to the ability to build, expand, and create new opportunities. There is a deep confidence in the idea that each generation can go further than the one before it, and leave its own mark on the world. Legacy matters, but evolution matters too. In the world of British old money, the priority tends to be different. There is a much greater appreciation for continuity, tradition, and the responsibility of preserving something that has crossed decades, or even centuries. Legacy isn't just important. Many times it is the very starting point. And perhaps that is exactly why so many people are fascinated by these two worlds, because they represent two completely different philosophies about wealth. One asks, what can we build? The other asks, what must we preserve? And depending on your personality, one of these visions will probably feel more appealing than the other. If you value independence, mobility, innovation, and the possibility of reinventing your own path, you may identify more with the American mindset. But if you value tradition, stability, continuity, and the feeling of being part of a story much greater than yourself, the British vision may seem far more fascinating. In the end, the answer to who lives better depends very much on what each person considers a successful life. Because some people dream of building something extraordinary, others dream of being part of something extraordinary, and that may be the most profound difference between American old money and British old money. But there is one final reflection that makes this comparison even more interesting. Because observing these two worlds, perhaps the greatest lesson is not about wealth. Perhaps it is about what happens when money stops being the main objective and becomes simply a tool for reaching something greater. And it is precisely there that we find the true answer to this story. Perhaps the most surprising part of this entire comparison is realizing that we are talking about two very different ways of reaching exactly the same goal. At first glance, American old money and British old money seem to belong to the same world. Both are surrounded by wealth, influence, and opportunities that few people will ever have access to during their lives. But the more we observe these families, the more we realize they follow different rules. On one side, we find a culture that admires those who build, who grow, who take risks, and transform opportunities into new fortunes. On the other, we find a culture that values continuity, tradition, and the ability to preserve something that has crossed entire generations. And perhaps that is exactly why the question, who lives better, has no definitive answer. Because it all depends on what you value. If freedom means being able to create your own path, build something new, and leave your personal mark on the world, the American old money mindset will probably seem more appealing. But if freedom means belonging to a greater story, being part of a centuries-old tradition, and carrying a legacy built across generations, the British old money universe may seem far more fascinating. In the end, perhaps the greatest difference between these two worlds is not in the amount of money they possess. Perhaps it is in the way they see the purpose of that money. For some, wealth exists to grow. For others, wealth exists to last. and that simple difference ends up shaping families, relationships, values, and lifestyles in ways that few people ever imagine. Now, I want to know your opinion. If you could choose to be born into one of these families, which would you choose? American old money or British old money? Leave your answer in the comments. And tell me which country you're watching from. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because in the next video, we are going to explore another fascinating world of wealth, status, and the families who live at the top of society. And if you want to start building your own financial legacy, check out the couple financial planner and vision board available in the description. See you next time.